Greetings, this is week one, lecture two. When I was a child growing up, I found myself in a liminal space, that space in between, and I didn't even know it. I lived in an all-white, middle to upper middle class neighborhood in the 1980s in rural Ohio. We had the run of the neighborhood as kids. From sunup to sundown, we'd get out on our bikes, we'd take off after breakfast and come home around dinner time. Rarely did my parents even think twice about where we were. They figured we were at Davies or Brian's or Richie's house that we knew when we had to be home. But what I'd taken for granted was quickly coming to an end. At the same time I was growing up in the residue of a culture that once thought it took a village to raise a child, I was at a school learning a different kind of language, the language of stranger danger. We were being taught and shown videos of some creepy dude in a trench coat that would come up and try to lure kids into the white panel van. We were taught to cry out stranger danger. If you don't know them, they might be bad, or simply assume they are bad, because we can never be too careful if we don't know them. I grew up in that liminal space, leaving a world my kids would never know for a fear-mongering world that they would know all too well. Now, all of this was on the backside of the tragic incident of the death of Adam Walsh in 1981, the young child of John Walsh, who would be known for America's Most Wanted. When Adam Walsh was abducted and brutally murdered, it sent shockwaves throughout the country and highlighted the danger of those unknown to us, the strangers, that at any time, kids could be snatched and grabbed. Fear and suspicion became the order of the day. Anyone we don't know that lives close to us, they could be some deviant, some malicious, maladjusted threat that could do harm to us. Kids in white communities were given shorter leashes. Now there was a random pedophile on every street corner, or so some thought, even though a majority of abuse doesn't come from a stranger but is someone known to the child. Kids stopped riding bikes around the neighborhood. Fences were erected in the backyards to keep the kids in and the strangers out. Air conditioning was added to the homes, making the lure of the summer heat less appealing, and families bought cable. Eventually, with fenced-in backyards and every bit of the luxury inside, and the fear of the other on the outside, we could roll up our garage doors, drive our vehicles safely inside, close the door, and close out all that lived close to us. Ironically, the more insulated we became from our neighbors, the more we began to fear our neighbor as stranger, other, danger. It's harder to fear what is known and close up. Fear drives us to insulation, isolation, and exclusion. Likewise, in urban neighborhoods in the 1970s and 80s, as crack began to flood the streets, vicious gangs took to the streets, and urban neighborhoods were often filled with random violence and shootings, and in many streets around the country they still are. Black moms and grandmas, fearing for the safety of their kids, worked hard, prayed hard that their children would not become another statistic of a systemically broken situation where they'd either be dead by 30 or incarcerated by 20. Kids are told, go to school, keep your head down, don't dress in the wrong colors, don't worry about making friends. Kids are told, avoid the streets where the cops are patrolling, lest you be stopped and harassed. Even those commissioned to serve and protect drew the suspicion of fear and villainy. Kids don't play in the front yards any longer. People don't sit on the porches any longer. Kids are often locked away in homes and apartments with the hopes that they can one day get out of the neighborhood and keep off the streets. Fear drives to insulation, isolation, and exclusion. Fear, though a biological blessing that alerts us to danger, is relationally incapacitating at times and destructive at others. The greater the fear, the greater our capacity to cordon ourselves off from others, define the limits of trust, adequacy, and safety more narrowly, and refuse the risk of what we've been told over and over can't hurt us. Fear has played an increasingly important role in American society. A fear that blanketed the white streets of suburbia in terms of stranger danger. A fear that gripped the urban streets of many cities because of drugs, gangs, and excessive violence. Fear drives us from one another, and in many cases answers the question for us, who is my neighbor? No one. Everyone is a potential threat. Nowhere is this more evident in the West than in our post-9/11 world. In a world that exists after the collapse of the two towers, fear becomes the primary commodity we traffic. In the aftermath of 9/11, after the shred of unity that brought us, and by us, I mean those obviously American, and by that I mean those who are white, brought us together. We were made neighbors for a moment because of the common enemy that we had, the stranger from a different land, the one that could do such great damage to us all. We sang country songs together for a while, gave money together, and we even attended church for a while together, for just a while. But we were given a new threat, someone else to fear, the person of color. Each of the men that had perpetrated such vicious evil had been brown Middle Easterners, and now as a result, we can identify that threat. We know what they look like. They have color. They are from somewhere else. We don't understand their customs. They aren't like us. However, exclusively we want to define that us, and often arbitrarily. They aren't the stranger in the trench coat and the panel van, though we must be careful of them as well. The threat is anyone of color that's carrying a backpack, has a beard, enters a coffee shop, goes into a mosque. The threat is anyone who might at any time blow up the hospital. Oh, wait, sorry, that's the doctor that's going in to do our operation. My bad. But implicitly, even then, we've been taught to fear that person who I hope doesn't kill me when they find out that I'm a Republican Christian. I've even actually heard those words spoken before. The threat is anyone that looks like they're Middle Eastern or brown or different. Anyone who is a threat to our way of life, and however we want to define our. Anyone that might want to take advantage of our country, our system. Anyone who might have come to this country to change our culture, to establish their customs, their law, or who has come here illegally, or who has been here illegally but hasn't assimilated to our culture and doesn't speak the same language, they ought to be considered suspicious as well. The threat is anyone that can cross illegally, come from the wrong country, looks scary, wears a hoodie, carries a bag, isn't like us, however we define us. Fear drives our apprehension when we go to the airport or look around the plane when we try to determine which seat we're going to sit in. Fear keeps us from wanting our backs to be against the door at the restaurant. Fear has moved us to lock down our schools, seeks to arm our teachers. Fear creates a hysteria of suspicion where at any moment, someone, anyone, but most often those that are nothing like me, are the threat of danger. Fear has made the gun production in this country a multi-billion-dollar industry where we're more concerned, where we're more often ready to ask the question at church, do you have a carry and conceal permit, instead of have you reached out to your neighbor this week? The stranger has become the threat has become the enemy, and neighboring that requires the risk has been shelved in hopes of avoiding the risks associated with the other. Neighboring feels impossible when suspicious fear drives our behavior. Neighboring on the backside of stranger danger, streets of violence, and post 9/11 hypersensitized vigilance is shrouded around the pervasive sense of fear. Reaching out seems to be an invitation of risk. We're better off to avoid the other, congregate in our homogenous bubbles, and concoct justifications for our bracketing out of the other. Fear leads us to the next couple of issues that we're going to talk about in the next lecture: the overgeneralization, stereotyping of others, and a political discourse that becomes so divisive that neighboring requires the political platform test before allowance of entry into our lives. Fear has led us to isolate or associate in our bland, homogenous bubbles. Fear has led us to be suspicious first before hospitality is possible. Fear has led us to fanaticism and further from friendship. Fear makes impossible substantive, life-giving relationships. Fear cripples our capacity for neighboring. And yet John says in his letter to us, perfect love drives out fear. What does that mean as we attempt to risk the questions, am I my brother's keeper? And who is my neighbor?